Welcome! You are listening to the CRM Success Show, where you will hear from CRM executives who have overseen some of the most interesting and complex CRM implementations. Your hosts, David Mosry and Kiro Whitey, will be bringing you real stories, real insight. Follow along on social media for updates on new episode releases, exclusive content, and much more. Enjoy the show, and thanks for listening.
Welcome. So today we're talking with Christy Grow, Senior Program Manager at Beacon Pointe, a fairly large RIA. So welcome, Christy.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Christy, before we start, I know you have a few legal touch points to talk about. So over to you.
Yes. We're working in financial services. For any of you can appreciate that we always have to have our disclaimer at the beginning of the call. So here's my legal spiel. These are views expressed by me. They don't necessarily reflect Beacon Pointe advisors. This conversation is intended for general informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal, tax, investment, financial, or other advice. It does not take into account the specific investment objectives, financial situation, or particular needs of any individual. Information shared is subject to change without notice.
Fantastic. All right. With that, so tell us a little bit about you, your background, and then lastly, just high level on Beacon Pointe.
Yeah, so I, like many people in the Salesforce ecosystem, have kind of a non-traditional background. So my degree is actually at clinical lab science. So I went to college for laboratory testing and did that for about a decade, kind of got bored, was looking for what I was going to do next, and didn't really want to go back to school if I could help it. I'd already paid off student loans. And so one day I was listening to a financial podcast, and this guy was on there talking about Salesforce and how he worked part-time doing Salesforce. And I had never heard of Salesforce, didn't know what it was, but he mentioned, if business processes interest you in solving problems, Salesforce might be a good career for you. And so I thought, sounds like there's free training. Let me go check it out. So got on Trailhead. It took me about 2 days on Trailhead before I figured out what Salesforce was or what companies used it for. And then after I figured it out, I thought, you know what, I'm going to prove that you can get a Salesforce cert without any paid resources. So I rather stubbornly didn't pay for any courses or anything. Not that those aren't beneficial. I think probably for a lot of people, they are a necessary part of the process, but I paid for a $20 practice exam from Salesforce, paid for the exam fee, which I got discounted because I went to one of the webinars. So all in, I think I, spent less than $200 to get into this career path. And then was super, super lucky to land my first job as a Salesforce admin at Goldman Sachs. And as you can imagine, really, really great experience there. I was working with a phenomenal team, learned a ton, and just, worked hard, kind of did whatever was needed of me, and ended up leading a team there. So I worked at Goldman for almost 5 years in a little part of Goldman that was an acquisition. So this was a RIA that was acquired by Goldman, and then I actually ended up being divested with that part of the company 4 years later. And during that divestiture is when I decided to kind of keep, warming my network, see what was out there in case I was made redundant in that process. So that's how I ended up at Osaic. Worked at Osaic for 2 years. Didn't love the broker-dealer space as much as the RIA space. And so a couple months ago, I heard about this opportunity at Beacon Pointe Advisors, and once I met with the CTO, David Lay, who is my now boss, just really saw that this was going to be a good opportunity for me, and made the jump. So now I work at Beacon Pointe. I manage the Salesforce team. Beacon Pointe has about 350 advisors across the US, 90 offices, 60 billion in assets under advisement, and really a family culture. One of the things that attracted me to Beacon Pointe is that we have an unusually large number of female leaders. So our CEO, our COO, our Chief Marketing Officer, Director of Compliance, Director of Marketing, chief wealth planning officer, all females. So that was very attractive to me as a fellow woman. And the financial services industry is quite male dominated, and so this is pretty unusual in the space. But yeah, I've been super happy. It's a great firm, and they are really a Salesforce shop. So that's been really cool. The last two companies I've worked for, senior executives didn't love Salesforce, and so it was always this battle of, well, we could use Salesforce for this, but we don't want to pay Salesforce money. And so now to be in a company that really is leveraging Salesforce, I would say, if not to its fullest extent today, that's the roadmap, right? Is to use Salesforce as much as we can to help grow the business. It's been a nice place to be.
For sure. I think what's really, so many questions I want to ask, but for the sake of time. So getting your first role in the Salesforce ecosystem, I think unless individuals look at your LinkedIn profile, we should probably disclose that you did have tech technology experience prior to that role. It was just in the form of like the medical industry, and it wasn't Salesforce, right? So what did you do prior when you were at Baylor Scott for 5 years?
Yeah, so one of the things that helped me kind of transition into this role is my last role at the hospital was called the point of care coordinator. So I was kind of bridging the gap between the lab and the testing that's done by the nurses. And they have a lot of instrumentation. So they take, blood glucoses, and they do chemistry panels at the bedside. And all of those results get uploaded into computer software. And so I got to work on a implementation of a new glucometer, which came with a new software. And so I really got to see kind of that technology development process before I really moved into the tech space. We loaded everything into a test environment first and then pushed things to production. And so I kind of got a taste of that development lifecycle, even though I wasn't the developer. And then, an implementation plan, both of the software and then the actual devices. And so, definitely leveraged that experience as I was interviewing and talking to people to land that first role.
Amazing. 4 years at Goldman, as you said, you managed 2 orgs, around 800 users on the B2C side, 100 users on the B2B side. What was the one takeaway you took with you from that role into your next role at Osaic? Because in 7 years, you've gone from, some would say, entry-level admin to, senior program management. You was a VP, prior to that, right? So you've accelerated your career very quick by leveraging your background and nailing it in the role since being in the Salesforce ecosystem. What was the one thing you took with you from Goldman to land that role at Osaic, would you say? What helped you the most?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's hard to nail down one thing, right? But if I have to say one thing, being willing to do what is needed for the organization. And that means looking beyond just your one little piece of the pie. I see so often, in team members that I'm coaching, in colleagues, that they spend a lot of, they're very willing to do what someone asks, right? So, their boss asks them to do something, they go and do it. But one of the reasons I was able to accelerate my career so quickly is because I was always thinking about the company and what can I do to help move the company forward? What can I do to help the company increase revenue? Ultimately, that's what a company is. Their primary focus is making money, right? And so, in your little role, whether you're a low-level admin. So it's funny you say that. My original ask by my boss when I joined Goldman was to write knowledge articles and work cases. And I want to say within 3 months, just because I asked, I said, hey, well, I can do this. And I was doing it. But then on the side, I said, hey, if you have like a field that needs to be created, I'm happy to, why not let me do that? This low level admin, and then the developers can focus on more exciting stuff. And so just being willing to do kind of those menial tasks that, nobody else really wants to do. And volunteering to pick up work. I did the same thing when I was at the hospital. I was always, if there was an opportunity to take on an additional responsibility, I was always the one volunteering, and pretty quickly people will come to you, right? So you volunteer for a couple times, and then and then your boss, your boss's colleagues, like people start asking, and that's really, I think, how I grew my career. And so by the time I was and I guess really at that point, I guess the other thing that I would say for people kind of in the career realm is after that first job, I really never, I have applied for jobs, but that's not how I actually got jobs, right? So the jobs that I've gotten have been by talking to people, letting them know, hey, I'm kind of thinking about making a change. Do you know of anything? And so the role I got at Osaic, that was a referral. The role I got at Beacon Pointe, someone reached out to me proactively and said, hey, I think you really vibe with the CTO. Do you want me to make an intro? And so I wasn't even seeking this role. It came to me. And I think when you're making the genuine connections, I know you guys talked about this with another guest on a podcast, but that organic networking when you don't need anything, that's really the key to having a very easy time moving around, making your career changes, getting the job that you want.
I was trying to think as you were talking, you reminded me of a podcast we did, and I wish I could remember which one it was, but the takeaway was act for the job you want versus the job you have. And I think what you shared is a testament to that. Going above and beyond, being naturally curious, trying to create the role that you want or do the things that are going to help you get to where you want to be. So kudos for that. Beacon Pointe, you talked a little bit about in your intro, just very quickly, and I'll hand over to Maz. Number of users, what you used, how big's your team, to give our listeners an idea, kind of what you're overseeing there.
Sure. So we have about 800 users. We are using Financial Services Cloud. We are a Salesforce shop, so we're using Salesforce for most of our core functionality. We don't really have custom applications, which is new for me because, like I said, my other firms, the CEOs were trying to move off of Salesforce, and so there was a lot of custom builds, but really Salesforce is our platform. So we do our tech support through Salesforce. We manage our client lifecycle, so prospecting, lead management, the client onboarding is all done in Salesforce. And then any of the client servicing, all of those, we are heavy users of cases. And so anything related to a client is logged as a case, and then somebody is working that case. We also use it for M&A activities. So Beacon Pointe is growing through acquisition of advisors and offices of advisors. And so our prospecting, more of like the B2B business, is also tracked in Salesforce. So any of the advisors or potential new offices that we want to bring on, all of that is tracked in Salesforce. Oh, and then my team size. So I have 3 internal employees right now. I had 4 contractors, and then a week ago, we just onboarded 4 more, a couple to help with data migrations for these offices that we're onboarding, and then a new developer. So excited to, almost double my team since I joined a couple months ago. And I think we will continue to grow as the company is growing, as we continue to leverage Salesforce. My team will grow. And that was one of the things that attracted me about the position. My boss told me when I interviewed, this is an opportunity to grow your dream team. And so a lot of the ideas I've had at previous firms to kind of create this cycle of, bring on junior people and train them up and promote them. I'm passionate about employing people in really like fair, ethical ways. And so I will never be the boss that tries to get someone for as little money as possible or, force them to leave because I won't pay them. I have this vision of cycling through, junior to senior team members. And so it's a really exciting opportunity for me to be able to actually bring that vision to life.
Yeah, that's awesome. Obviously, it's always great, when you can see a junior employee flourish and grow. It's one of the most satisfying things of hiring. Now I'm my own boss. I can control salaries. So it's a lot easier to be generous. And I guess when you're internal and you got to deal with budgets and more senior people above you, and then also not only that, fairness to other people on the team, or at least perceived fairnesses. So definitely want to talk about FSC and Financial Services Cloud, specifically in wealth management. I think or at least I wouldn't be surprised, is probably Salesforce's biggest industry. It's definitely their biggest industry cloud. I think it was their first one too. And then so they originally had the managed package version, and then they had the industries cloud version. So tell me, it's definitely also I think the most mature of all the industry clouds. I don't know if that's true anymore. Health or nonprofit, I think is also pretty mature as well. Those are definitely the three that are the most. But getting back to usage, I know you mentioned cases. Um, I know that that's often used for like tasks that got to go back to the custodian to interface with outside parties. Um, but it's generally well. I'll let you talk to this. How do your advisors generally use Salesforce, or maybe better in the wealth management industry? How do they generally use it?
Yeah. So, what I have found in my experience in wealth management is that the advisors are usually not the ones using Salesforce. So they usually have, some admins or a chief of operations that are really entering a lot of the data into Salesforce. That may not be as true at Beacon Pointe because we are such a Salesforce shop, but I've only been here 2 months, so I haven't spent a lot of time talking to advisors, but we have an advisor conference next week. So I'm curious to see how many of the advisors actually are in there versus their staff. But if we're talking about advisors and their staff, which is usually how we talk about advisors internally, they are using them. I would say that the primary use case is for tracking their client service scene. So if there are tasks that need to be done for a client, and again, this is typically they have staff that are tracking those tasks. So maybe they need to send out an annual mailing, or they need to collect some documents from a client. There's probably a task. Now at Beacon Pointe, this is something interesting I've never seen done before. At Beacon Pointe, we essentially created cases that you would typically see in a task. And the reason that they did that, and I've been kind of mulling over whether I agree or disagree with this approach, but I'm kind of getting sold on it. So we built cases for essentially everything that we do for a client. And the reason is because, in another industry, I think it's more common that you have an action item that's, did you do it or did you not? But in the financial services industry, a lot of those action items either stretch over days or touch a lot of people. There might be multiple people that need to be involved in that action item. So for example, you meet with the client and the client says, oh, well, I want to open a new account. And so, someone needs to track that they asked for that new account. And then someone actually has to go and, draft up paperwork for the account opening. And then someone has to submit that to the custodian. And so it's really this multi-step process. And so we really don't use tasks for anything that you would typically see tasks being used for. It's all done in cases. And so I would say that that's really like tracking client meetings, the action items that come out of the client meetings, and then anything in between the client meetings is really the bulk of what we see advisors and their staff doing in Salesforce.
Yeah. The activity workflow in with wealth managers is fairly complex, right? Because also often it also requires multiple rounds of approvals, and that's another reason why you have cases. And sometimes you need someone who has access to the custodian to actually do it, and the advisor is not allowed to do it because of segmentation of activities. So it's a complicated thing, particularly when it comes to money movements, right? It's not just I'm opening an account; I need to move funds between my trusts or whatever it is, or to to beneficiary and that kind of stuff. Real cool. So you guys are an FSC. Obviously, that decision predates you, but maybe with a Goldman. But at some point, right, you were looking at, okay, do we go with FSC, or do you go just with Salesforce Core, right, Service and Sales Cloud, or now what they're called Agent Force Service, Agent Force Sales. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about that. Like, what are the benefits and cons, let's say, of choosing FSC versus the core product in your mind, and what's that decision process look like?
Yeah, so it's been really interesting working at a few different firms now that all had Financial Services Cloud, but I would say this is the first firm where they're actually using it. And this is something that for anyone who isn't already on Financial Services Cloud, I would just encourage you to think about. So Financial Services Cloud is very tailored to the industry. I will say that it's very tailored to the industry, the part of the industry that I am now. So that wealth management, advisor servicing the clients. When I was at Osaic as a broker dealer, and really the advisor was our primary client, it didn't work quite as you would expect. And I'm not sure that was a great use case for Financial Services Cloud. I probably, if I, was advising the broker dealer to start over, probably would have said, just use Sales Cloud. You don't really need that, customer 360 view for your advisor. I mean, yes, you need a lot of similar data points, but it was probably overkill for that space. But one of the things that I think people should consider if they're looking, and I'm not trying to sway anyone, one way or another. I know Salesforce is very passionate about Financial Services Cloud, and it is a good cloud. In fact, the little part of Goldman I worked for was United Capital prior to the Goldman acquisition, and they actually helped Salesforce, gave them a lot of feedback to develop the Financial Services Cloud. And so we were actually using, even though we technically had FSC installed in the org, we were not using person accounts, and we had created our own householding structure even prior to FSC. And so I would say and I'm curious, Maz, you've done a lot in the Financial Services Cloud, if you agree with this, but my take after a couple of orgs is that if you're going to implement Financial Services Cloud, you should be ready to implement person accounts. Would you agree with that? Or do you think, or have you seen implementations where they were able to leverage FSC without using person accounts?
I think they force you to now, the new one.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. See, I've worked in orgs that were kind of legacy before some of these recent. And so this is actually the first org I've worked in with person accounts.
A lot of people don't like them. I never found the big issue with them. My biggest complaint is that it doubles up your storage because it counts as 2 records, but that doesn't really bother me. In terms of FSC, I tend to look at it as 2 things. If you need householding and financial account centric stuff, FSC is probably the way to go. If you're in a more peripheral financial services industry that's not necessarily dealing with end consumer clients, like you said, like with broker dealers.
The broker dealer. Yeah, that was my experience as well.
Yeah, or even if you're like, let's say, a venture capitalist, or like a REIT type firm, right? Where you may not need that kind of householding financial account centric thing. For sure, like asset managers that deal with mutual funds, right? And their clients are the broker dealers, right? You may not need that kind of thing. So that's how I tend to look at it. It's really, if you're looking at financial account centric, and relationship householding centric, that's really where it shines, I think.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's cool to hear your perspective too. So yeah, I think for people looking at it, like being prepared to use person accounts, and I mean, even though person accounts are enabled, you can use non-person accounts even in FSC org. But I have found that the out of the box features kind of assume that you're using person accounts, and even as we've added integrations at Beacon Pointe, a lot of the vendors assume that you're using person accounts if you're on FSC, and so to really leverage it fully, and this is where I say, my last 2 firms were not really they were paying for FSC, but they weren't really getting the value out of it because they didn't have person accounts enabled. There's a lot of functionality that comes out of the box with FSC, and so this is one of the things that I would say are pros. So there's really robust relationship like management. So being able to visualize those relationships. So it's not uncommon in the financial services world for a client to, have a spouse, have some children, maybe they also have an LLC or a trust. And so you want to visualize all of those relationships, which is pretty easy to do out of the box in FSC versus, if you're in a Sales Cloud org, it's going to take a little bit more work and customization to show those relationships in the same way. And then things like action plans, there's a lot of tasks in or action items in the financial services world that are very repeatable. So, every client is going to have an annual meeting. When you're opening an account, you're going to do X, Y, and Z thing. And so Financial Services Cloud makes it really easy to set up those kind of prefab task sequences. And like I said, at Beacon Pointe, we're not really using tasks, but it's something I'm kind of considering, could we add action plans to a case that goes to operations where maybe the ops folks are working in those sequence tasks and they're not having to generate the action items every time. So that's one of the things that I'm looking for. As far as the cons, it is quite a bit more expensive. Now, Salesforce will usually cut you deals on licenses because they want people to use Financial Services Cloud, but it's still ultimately going to be more expensive. And kind of a pro and a con. So FSC, I believe now, is built on unlimited cloud. And so you're going to see typically higher API limits and things like that. But that comes also at a cost. So if you anticipate having a lot of integrations with your Salesforce org, that's another consideration. You might be better off getting FSC and kind of getting that bundle.
I think just on the cost piece, because I did do a little bit of research on that, just as I know that's something that comes up maybe for those that maybe are having this debate. FSC typically costs around 300 a user versus Sales Cloud at 165. If you're looking at a 50 user org, that's 80K, 100 user org, that's 160K difference. In reality, that could fund, a Salesforce admin or product owner internally, or a couple of resources nearshore. So it is a debate you've got to make, right? And that is my 2 cents on the topic.
Yeah,
I'm going to put myself back on mute for you, Maz.
Yeah, just a disclaimer on that. Salesforce negotiates. The list price is not what anybody pays, right? But there's definitely a price differential between standard and FSC, and there's definitely an uplift.
It's about double, I think, either way.
Yeah, I would probably agree with that. But again, negotiate with your rep. So let's talk about person accounts. So what are your reservations with it? I know a lot of people don't like it. I'm a little bit more on the data side, so I'm not doing so much Salesforce config. So yeah, what are your issues with it?
So I do have some issues. My comments earlier were more around, I have seen orgs that are using Financial Services Cloud and not using person accounts. And I actually think if you're going to use Financial Services Cloud, you should be using person accounts. The place where I think Salesforce kind of got it wrong here, and nothing we can do about it now except to express my frustration, is that really what you needed, I don't think you really needed to combine the contact and the account so much as you needed that extra layer of householding. And so I think what Salesforce could have done and probably should have done is kept the contact separate and then turned the account into that household structure. Now you kind of have this contact and account that is related to an account, and it causes some unnecessarily complicated architecture issues with the contact and the so now, for your person account, you have both a contact ID and an account ID, and sometimes you have to use the contact ID and sometimes you have to use the account ID depending on what you're loading. So the data loads get a little messier. And then one of the things we're working on right now with Salesforce, I just had a call with them today, is the relationships. Do you have an account to account relationship or account to contact? And I found, and I'm working through, I'm hoping that Salesforce has a solution for this, but some of the icons. So, when you're looking at that relationship component right now in the org, which I'm hoping we can change, is you see contact icons for the person accounts, even though, our users are used to seeing that person account icon when you're on the record layout. So I find it quite confusing for an end user. I'm pretty technical, so, I understand what's happening on the back end, but for a non-technical advisor or their staff, I think it's a little confusing to have the contact and the person account and both icons show up depending on where you're at in the org.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just to point out that person accounts isn't designed for FSC, right? It's designed for anything. So a lot of industries, and I would say most B2C industries, don't really care about the household, right? I'm running an
That's a fair point.
Right? I need a person account. I don't care whose cousin he is, right? So,
yeah. And so, maybe what they should have done, because I've always worked in financial services, industry, since I've been with in the Salesforce ecosystem, I guess wrongly assumed until now, you've just educated me that that person accounts were made for financial services. But yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense that was not the primary.
Yeah, I even think for a while they had something called like an individual account.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not fully up to date on it, but I think FSC now you have to use it on the new industries FSC. I'm not 100% sure. I do want to touch on the M&As. It's one of my favorite things because obviously I'm a data guy. We do tons of data migrations. Financial services, particularly wealth managers, buying other wealth managers is a big part of what we do. It seems like they have more acquisitions than Salesforce SIs, a lot more. That just to speak to how many there are. So you actually have a person dedicated to it. Pretty cool. Yeah, how do those goes? Like there are two approaches when I see that. I see is let me just get my financial accounts, my people's, my household, my relationships. Generally, there's no overlap in data because nobody uses two wealth managers. They tend to have one. And then, yeah, you migrate that. And then there's the approach of I need everything. I need all my notes. I need all my history. I need my, all of it. So, yeah, what are your guys' philosophy on this?
Yeah, and I'll kind of tell you what prior firms have done and then what Beacon Pointe does. And I was actually really relieved when I came in and this was the expectation. So prior firms, they kind of let people bring everything. They were, quick to add pick list values and customizations for these specific offices. And you've probably seen this, Maz, it gets messy really fast. and so Beacon Pointe, we've really set the expectation that we have a standard way of doing things. And if you're going to join Beacon Pointe, then you will integrate into the Beacon way of doing things. And so, a rare exception here or there. And we do, one of the interesting things that I haven't seen done before, but maybe you've seen this, is we have a legacy object. So we map everything that's kind of standard and expected into our standard model. And then if there is legacy data that they want to maintain or not really maintain, but they want to see from within Salesforce, then we'll migrate that into this legacy object, with a little bit of the catch-all, but it keeps all of that randomness contained to this one table in Salesforce that's all accessed from in a consistent way, even though the data itself varies, and so it makes the data a lot cleaner on the go forward basis, which I've really appreciated. I think it's a good approach. Now, I'm not the one telling the advisors the bad news, so I'm not sure how well this is received with new advisors, but we did about 20 acquisitions last year, so it must not be scaring away too many people.
No, very common. Sorry, Kira, one sec. So what I do is I actually migrate into a rich text field and format it as opposed to a separate object. It works nice, looks great on the screen. Don't pay extra storage.
Yeah.
It's fine. I mean, I'm learning so much from you both, so I'm happy to be a fly on the wall for this conversation. So, your experience in wealth management, you've seen 3 different organizations, from enterprises that could be all the way to small, still large, but in the traditional kind of corporate sense. Let's say smaller than a Goldman Sachs type of equivalent. I know one of the topics we talked about that you were really passionate and interested about was, what does good agile methodology look like in the wealth management industry specifically? Do you want to start with maybe setting the scene in terms of and you could pick any example of the 3 and compare and contrast all three businesses. But what was agile in place? Was it true agile? Was it a agile hybrid approach? Was it nothing? Right? Just kind of, the floor is yours on this topic for 15-20 minutes to kind of share what you would like to share from your lessons and lessons learned.
Sure. And I'll just put the disclaimer out that I am not an agile expert. And I probably, my, understanding and implementation of agile is probably a little, has my own spin to it. But it's been interesting because yeah, I definitely, Agile, at Goldman, we were doing Agile and Scrum, and then Osaic was using the scaled Agile framework. And then I came to Beacon Pointe, and they said they were working in sprints, but there were no start and end dates to their sprints. It was very loosey goosey, and so it's been interesting to see the different ways of working. And I think one of the messages I want to get across is that, for those who say they're doing Agile, I highly recommend going and reading the Agile Manifesto, because the very first line in the manifesto is individuals and interactions over process and tools. And it's just so fascinating to me that these organizations say they're doing Agile, and then they're so rigid about the process and the documentation. And it seems to just completely go against the very manifesto that they claim to be using. So that would be just kind of my first takeaway. And then one of the things that I think is could be potentially beneficial to your listeners is that even if you're a really small organization, using some sort of framework, or really, I think about it as like an organizational structure, is really helpful. So you get to an enterprise level, and it's really a necessity. Like, you cannot run a team of 20, 30 developers without some sort of project management, right? And but then you might be a solo admin, or a very small team, or when I first got to Beacon Pointe, I had two internal employees and 2 developers, and so fairly small team. And like I said, they were operating very loosey goosey, and they were getting development done. But what I found is that a lot of work was making it into our staging environment, but never to production. And so they're just there wasn't a good tracking mechanism. And so when I think about Agile and Scrum, and working on, in a sprint cadence, and having some sort of tool. So I'm fairly tool agnostic, but, having some software to track the changes. I mean, you could build something out in Salesforce if you wanted. I've used Jira, I've used Azure DevOps. Having some project management tool to be able to track the work that the team is doing. Again, even if you're a solo team, being able to track what you're doing. And then, from an agile perspective, making sure that you're actually talking to your end users and you are iterating quickly. So one of the other things that I've seen time and time again with people claiming to do Agile, they're tracking changes in a way that looks, they're working sprints, they're maybe they're deploying frequently, but more often than not, I see kind of a waterfall approach that's just broken out into sprints. And I don't know, Maz, if you've seen similar things in your career, but it's working quickly, failing quickly, iterating, getting things in front of end users. For me, that's one of the core takeaways from the Agile methodology is just making sure you're not spending 3, 6, 12 months before you ever get something in front of an end user to look at.
Yeah, so it's changing a lot recently. I'll let you know why in a second. So a lot of people don't notice I'm actually PMP certified, been since like 2008 when it was like a big thing. So one of the things in the Agile Manifesto, which I never thought I would meet someone else who read it, by the way. So congratulations. I think you're the first person. And to keep in mind that this was written way back when, right? Late 90s, early 2000s. I'm not quite sure exactly when. Is code before documentation, right? But now with AI, what's happening is it's documentation before code, because you feed your documentation into the scripting agent, and then it generates the code. So you have to really have good documentation. And then going back to having your tools, like now, if you're using Jira, right, you got to track work. Otherwise, like, I don't know how you don't know what got released when
Right.
to trace down a bug later. But yeah, so if you're tracking your stuff in Jira, the AI agents can now sometimes do the pull right at Jira, try to code it, check it in, and then someone can review it. But it also it needs the documentation, because that's really how you communicate with any kind of form of AI. It's via data, even unstructured. So it's becoming really, really, really important, and that's changing, and it's going to continue to change. With regard to waterfall versus agile, so my background is much, much, much more on the SI implementation partner side, and where we have contracts, like actual contracts, to say we got to deliver X. So it's never true agile because of that, because we have like real contractual binding deliverables, right? And if we're not going to deliver on that, or we're going to change, it's not like you get into a meeting and you say, yeah, let's do this instead, right? It's a significant, legal contractual change. So you can never do true agile, but they all claim to do it, and what they do mean is mini waterfall sprints, working towards a goal, but they do have a full plan of where you're going to go. And I would probably recommend that approach. It is my preferred approach. There used to be a joke of agile projects don't fail, right? They just run out of money or time, and then they stop, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that I have found to help with that is to really, I my last role was pure product management, and I thought I wanted to live in that space, but I missed owning the resources that were actually doing the work. And so it's nice to be back in more of a hybrid role. And so one of the things that is really important to me in my work is really defining the business goals first versus the project goals and outcomes. And what I mean by that is, what problem are we actually trying to solve? And then we can figure out the technical implementation to solve that problem, but that makes it a little bit more clear, I think, when you're going to do the work is, you can iterate on the implementation, but as long as you still get to that end goal, and I have found that helps.
I'm going to ask you a couple of questions on those, identifying problems and turning that into metrics to track in a moment. But I did just want to add for our listeners, Maz, you got pretty good memory. The Agile Manifesto was created in 2001 by 17 software developers in Utah.
So you read it too, Kiro?
I didn't know. I used AI to find out the answer. It was introduced with 4 core values and 12 principles. So there you go. It is. What is that? Quarter of a century old, 25 years, right? So no, it's 25 years old, whatever that is, right? A quarter
century, Kiro.
It's getting on in the day. So so more importantly, coming back to problems and metrics. So within wealth management specifically, obviously you've got to define success. People want to be in an agile, they want to work in an agile way. It's still seemed as like the sexy way, fast, innovative. We're a cool company, blah, blah, blah. Waterfall's almost kind of like, oh, they're so old school. What metrics have you found, like in these environments, that you're tracking to determine successful in terms of cycle times and things like that? Like, for example, is it as simple as a reduction in time for account opening, for example, or were there any kind of constants between the 3 roles you've had that you've seen in each role when it comes to like actual end user impact that Agile has helped to track or measure or record against?
So as far as like business outcomes, I think that's very like project specific, but kind of as a framework, what is most important to me, and I think I've developed this passion over the last few companies I've worked for, is really are our end users happy? So you can track that with things like NPS score, but ultimately, are you talking to your users? And I think this is where a lot of people get it wrong. And I'll be honest, in my first Salesforce role, I was not talking to as many end users as I should have been. But as I have learned and grown in my career, I've realized just how important that is. And it depends on the company. Sometimes you have a very large company and you'll have product people sitting between, the people actually doing the Salesforce development and the business, and sometimes multiple layers. My last company was quite advanced at convoluting the process of getting, feedback from the end users to the people actually who could do something about it. But one of the things that I love is forming focus groups. So if you are one of those people working in the ecosystem and you've never actually talked to an end user, or you're not doing it often enough, I love forming focus groups, and you can usually find people pretty easily who are willing to give feedback. And you can go about that a few different ways. You can actually go into Salesforce and see who is using the system the most, because those are probably the people that are most likely to give you feedback. If you work in a firm that has relationship managers or people who are kind of talking to your end users on a regular basis, you can go ask them for recommendations. Hey, who's a really, who knows the system really well, and also who doesn't know the system well? Because you kind of need both people, right? You don't want to build just to the super savvy people, but you also want to build for the people who are not tech savvy, don't really know how to use the platform, because ultimately that's the best outcome, right? If you can create a platform that is intuitive and easy to use, even for people who are not tech savvy, then I think you've really won. So end user satisfaction, and then I am very passionate about getting code to production quickly, and so I don't measure this formally today, but after this conversation, maybe I will start doing that. From idea to getting it live, how quickly are you doing that? Now, you don't want to push things too early. You want to make sure you have enough conversation about, is this really the right thing that we're doing? But again, one of the things I found when I joined Beacon Pointe is that there's all of this configuration that had just been sitting. I mean, sometimes a year. I think it was 2 or 3 weeks in, I was chatting with someone from the data team who manages our Tamarack integration. She's like, I just need this button in production. And I'm like, well, you got to get on the list. She's like, no, it's ready. I've tested it. It just needs to be pushed to production. She's been waiting for a year. I mean, that again, like, if you're not tracking, if you don't have a solid project management system, and you can do this in, a Microsoft Word document if you need to, just some way to track what is in the pipe, what is complete, some sort of statusing around the work that's being done, so that you don't get this messiness and really ultimately end user dissatisfaction because they asked for something and it took you a year to do something that should have taken a week or two.
I feel like that is, we were talking a little bit about weekend plans at the beginning. It's like all those like tick list things you've had around the house that you've been meaning to do for so long. Change that light bulb in the garage, or repaint that kitchen cabinet that got scuffed by your electric Hoover. Things like that. Just like, it's a quick job, but it's just like the mental capacity of getting it done. I think we actually spoke to somebody who, as a best practice, every quarter he has his dev team just work on pure small tickets like that, just to get it into production and keep sales, those heavy sales environment, and keep the sales reps happy. Just kind of set it as like a fun, kind of lunch in the office, speak out, let's just have our devs build, no meetings, just let's get as many of these admin-y type stuff out the way and done. So anyway, we digress slightly. Focus group frequency, that's what I wanted to ask you about. How often is, like, obviously it's a fine balance between overkill and letting team stick to what they're doing and get stuff done. What have you found to be a good balance of cadence for how many focus groups with these different users? What would you recommend?
Sure. So I would say it kind of depends on what project you're working on. Like once a month for 45 minutes to an hour, I find in normal circumstances to be pretty good. If I've got something really big coming up and I need a lot of testing, then I might add some additional meetings. But during normal times, I would say one meeting, 45 minutes to an hour. 30 minutes just never seems to be long enough. So definitely recommend doing a longer stretch less frequently than the latter, unless you're in a season of heavy testing, but that has worked well for me.
And have you found a secret to keeping business stakeholders, like relationship managers, the more technical business-facing stakeholders, engaged through these sprints?
Two things that I have found to be very crucial in stakeholder management. So the first is transparency. And this is where something like Jira or ADO becomes really important. A lot of people are scared to give stakeholders access to those systems. In my very first role, people did not want stakeholders to have access. But as soon as I had the authority to give people access, I gave them access, because one, I don't want people pinging me every day asking, hey, what's the status of this? I want to empower them to go look themselves. I want them to have dashboards where they can see, okay, here are my 5 requests. This one is in progress, this one is still pending, and this one is live, without having to come to me. But then that transparency also helps people to be more patient, I have found. So when somebody has no idea where their request is in the life cycle, then they get really antsy. They typically are unhappy. But I have found that even if you tell someone, I'm sorry, it's going to be 6 months, if they know and they trust. So that's the other piece of it, is you can't tell them 6 months and then you get to the 6 months and you forgot to do it. But if you tell them 6 months and then you actually deliver it 6 months later, then that I have found is much better than not telling them at all. And then the other one is relationship building. So I know, Kiro, you're really good at this as part of your job, but building the relationships. And first thing I did when I got to Beacon Pointe was, okay, who do I need to talk to? Who do I need to build relationships with? And I started doing that. And so again, it builds that trust. And so if I tell someone that, yeah, sorry, this is going to take 4 weeks, or this is really, really big, we can't even talk about this yet. But then if there's something really little, I just go ahead and do it. If someone needs a pick list value and it's not going to affect any automation, then we're just going to do that and we're going to get it out quickly. And it's not going to go to the bottom of the list, below these strategic projects. And so balancing the transparency and the relationship building, it's something that I love doing, the stakeholder management. And so maybe it comes easier to me than other people, but those two things will go a long way if you're managing stakeholders.
Amazing. So general thoughts on Agentforce and AI in Salesforce. Makes sense to talk about it from a wealth management perspective, given background, but also in your current environment. What are your takeaways?
Yeah, so we are planning to implement Agentforce this year, probably around that case management entry point. I did do a POC at Osaic about a year ago now that I will say did not go particularly well. One thing I will say is that, at least for us, it was not as plug and play as Salesforce made it sound at Dreamforce, which, probably no surprise to anyone here. But especially if you're working in an enterprise org where there's a lot of security and you need to build things in a certain way. I think, for some people that maybe are not in as highly regulated industries, maybe there's a little more or a little less concern around security, but our orgs have pretty large levels of privacy data, and so it's always going to be a little slower to do anything, and making sure that any data that is going into a AI engine is secure and protected. We're not sending data off to Salesforce or any other vendor is always a concern. So I would say it took longer to implement even a very small use case. But I think once you kind of have that foundational layer done, then any additional work is probably, I didn't stay long enough to find out what that next phase would have looked like. But to be fair, it was not a great AI use case. We had gotten some funding from Salesforce to do a POC, and we're working on a very tight timeline. So we didn't necessarily pick the best use case, but I'm excited to try it again. The two places that I see a lot of value in AI is around knowledge retrieval. So, people probably use ChatGPT, Gemini a lot for this. You ask a question, it searches very, very large volumes of data and it returns an answer. That type of functionality in Salesforce, especially in financial services, give me a summary of my client or tell me all the open cases for this client, things like that. I think will be really valuable once we implement. We are going to do a hybrid of Salesforce AI and some other AI engines. And then the other one is around actually submitting the case. So this is the one I'm probably most excited about. I just had a conversation with some folks at my firm today about this, where, rather than click through several menus in a case creation workflow, you tell the bot, hey, I need to open a case for this client. And then the bot, you kind of have this conversation around what you need to be able to submit that case. You upload what you need to upload, and then that case is generated for you rather than having to kind of follow the prompts in the UI. So those are the two places where I think AI is pretty solid already. I think over time it will get more powerful, but some of the more advanced use cases I think still have some problems. And but yeah, curious your guys' thoughts, how you're using AI and and where you think it's going.
This podcast is all about you, Christy. So, I mean, look, I think with Agentforce specifically, the most common use cases have been, case management, bot support, kind of functionality. We have a podcast coming out in the next couple of days. Going to talk a bit more about that. So we won't talk too much for now. But I think yes, 12, 18 months ago probably was a bit premature, but we are hearing and having more guests on the podcast that I talked about, Agentforce successfully deployed in the workspace and in live environments, and some wins there. I guess in terms of Agentforce use cases, you talk a little bit more about AI in general, right? And some of the case management stuff and your experience at Ozark and how that leans into this. You're right. The most common scenario we're seeing is from a service perspective, the idea of reducing physical agents with, Agentforce agents. I'm curious, and we're curious, is there any other potential ideas around Agentforce that you might have or think would be good use cases for Agentforce specifically in wealth management?
So one other interesting idea that we were kind of talking about at Ozark, but never got to implement. I'm sure they eventually will, but we called it the magic button. So advisors typically spend a lot of time prepping for a client meeting. And so if they could just click a button and get all of their meeting notes, all of the relevant information for a client, just think of how much time, typically an hour of time prepping for a meeting. It could be more, it could be a little less. But with a click of a button, all of that work was done for them. I think that's a pretty powerful use case. And if an advisor has 100 clients, then that time savings adds up pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's like a tear sheet type thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when you have that, let us know, because I think I would add that. I'd be an interested customer. What's next? We're talking about Agentforce, AI, a little bit more there. Anything else in terms of your team and Beacon Pointe and any other projects non-related to AI and Agentforce that you've got on the list for this year?
So I would say some of our top roadmap items, we're doing a Slack integration, which I'm pretty excited about. I used Slack back at United Capital pre-Goldman days and loved it, miss being able to thread conversations. You can't do that in Teams. So excited about that. We're doing a lot of integrations right now, Schwab, Fidelity, Wove. So I think it's going to be exciting to see all of the data that we can surface within Salesforce, so that advisors don't have to go to all these platforms. It's a pretty common complaint in the wealth management space that advisors have too many tools. They want one place to go to do all of their work and to service their clients. And so the more that we can surface within Salesforce and then just send out by API to our vendor partners, the happier I think our advisors ultimately will be.
Yeah, for sure. And yes, Maz, we're going to ask about Dreamforce. even though we are several months away. Is it on the cards for you this year? If some of our listeners who aren't in Dallas, maybe they might be able to see you in person and say hello. Will you be there this year or no?
I hope so. I need to talk to my boss, see if Beacon Pointe will pay for it. But I believe he and one of my other colleagues went last year. So we'll say I'm hopeful.
Yeah, we know tickets aren't out yet, but we're just excited. And obviously that's where I think the first time we put proper faces to names, obviously we were talking prior to that, but a couple of years ago at the airport on the way home, I think, if memory serves correct. So we'll just, with that, like to say thank you for being involved in today's episode of the CRM Success Show. We really appreciate your time, and I really enjoyed learning a bit more about your journey in Salesforce and the focus on the wealth management space. Last question, was that an intentional decision to go into wealth management? Was that an area that just interested you, or was it just pure coincidental? You got one role and that was a snowball effect to stay in?
Yeah, it was a happy accident, I'll say. I was interested in personal finance from a young age. I read the book Rich Dad Poor Dad when I was 12 years old, and many more books since then. So I've always had a passion for personal finance. And so when I landed the role at Goldman, I thought, oh, this could not have been more perfect for me, marrying the tech that I wanted to do and the personal finance. So yeah, happy accident. But now that I'm here, I have found that people in the financial services industry, with Salesforce specifically, typically look for people who have that experience. And so now I feel like it's a niche that I won't ever be able to leave, which is okay.
You play it to your advantage. Again, thank you. And for our listeners, please do not forget to subscribe to the CRM Success Show for more episodes featuring phenomenal leaders like Christy Grow. Thanks all.
Thanks so much for having me.